Looking to hear some counterpoints on my views regarding Ukraine and Israel wars. So I'm an American citizen of Ukrainian ethnicity and I consider myself to be fairly liberal and leftist. I have generally been pretty opposed to most U.S. wars such as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, in the current situation I find myself agreeing with the U.S. government stance of supporting Ukraine and Israel, but I would like to hear both sides and do research. I am not really certain of what the arguments of those who are pro-Russia and pro-Palestine are in these conflicts. In particular, 1. For Ukraine people who say US should stop sending money and weapons to Ukraine. What alternative is there? Do people who believe this view think that Ukraine should just be conquered? Or do they believe that the US sending weapons makes the situation worse and that Ukraine can defend itself alone? My opinion is that without Western military support Ukraine would just get conquered, which a negative outcome for people who value state sovereignty. What do people who are against sending Ukraine weapons or pro-Russia feel on this issue? 2. For the Israel-Hamas war. While I agree that Israel's tactics and killing of Palestinian civilians is awful, I am curious what the alternative is. Basically, the way I see it, Hamas openly claims it wants to destroy Israel and launched an attack killing civilians. Any country having such an enemy on its border would want to eliminate that enemy. I don't think there is any country in the world that would not invade a neighbor that acts that way. Perhaps on a tactical execution level they can do things to cause less civilian casualties, but ultimately invading Gaza with the goal of eliminating Hamas seems like a rational thing to do. I understand that people who are pro-Palestine want innocent civilians to not die, which I of course 100% agree with, but do they want Israel and Hamas to just peacefully coexist? That feels like a non-option given Hamas' attack last month. Apologies for being brief, but Ukraine is being occupied by Russia, so I support Ukraine. Palestine is being occupied by Israel, so I support Palestine. It's as simple as that. Trump admires Putin's authoritarian style and power, and this makes some MAGA Republicans pro-Russia. There's also a strong isolationist tendency that is starting to creep back into the Republican platform. In my opinion, this is all madness. If you can figure out 2, you'll be in line to win this year's Nobel Prize for Peace. I'm curious as to the whole I'm against the war in Afghanistan stance. Are you saying the US should have left al-Qaeda to freely operate within Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban? Or are you saying that they were justified to go in and gut AQ themselves but should have left after that and not attempted the whole nation building thing? Also, if the nation building actually worked and the Taliban didn't come back to power after the US left, and Afghanistan was now a democracy that respects human rights, would you still be against the nation building and war against the Taliban? I view it as Israel trying to occupy more of West Bank and Gaza, just like Russia is trying to occupy Ukraine. Gaza and West Bank resistance is trying to fight that off like Ukraine is and keep their homes and land. I agree with most you say, except that Israel doesn't have tactics of killing civilians. That's a lie that keeps being repeated, but it does not make it true. There were several amount of civilians killed in the war on ISIS after the Paris attack. Anyone who can't suggest an actual way to fight this kind of terror org like ISIS Hamas should not make such unbiased claims. Regarding the Hamas-Israel conflict, what muddied the water for me was learning that Hamas was formed after Israel boxed in Gaza. I.e., Gaza traps 2 million Palestinians in a tiny strip of land, giving them the humanitarian minimum to survive and expecting them to behave. I agree that given the threat of Hamas, any country would do what Israel is doing. But on the flip side, Any country would also turn to violence and hatred if you treated them like Gaza has been treated. For the war in Ukraine, there are a lot of people in the US, mostly on the right, who have an isolationist mindset that the war is not the problem of the US government and therefore no aid should be sent. Most of these people aren't pro-Russia, but rather indifferent to the outcome of the war. These sentiments have primarily been driven by the wars in the Middle East over the past 2 decades. Ukraine is a sovereign nation and its totally unjustified invasion by Russia should be resisted, with the full cooperation of the major stakeholders. But those stakeholders are European countries, not the US. If the EU is not willing to dedicate all their resources to helping the Ukrainians first, I don't see why the US should follow suit. Ukraine was not a member of NATO when attacked, and it is up to her Western neighbors to back their ideals with money and weapons. The US should remain focused on containing China and solving domestic crises which are threatening its national security far more than foreign conflicts. 1. Most people arguing that the US should not send money are either anti-West and want Russia to win, to screw the West over, or just take an isolationist view of not our problem. I don't want my tax money going to Ukraine. 2. Israel isn't killing Palestinian civilians as a deliberate tactic. Civilian casualties are an unfortunate byproduct of fighting in such a dense urban environment. If Israel was actually trying to kill civilians, the death toll would be much higher. 1. Russia invaded Ukraine in an attempt to establish empire on the bodies of Ukrainians. 2. Israel has been stealing the homes and lands of the Palestinians since 1947. If they did that to my family and myself, I would pick up arms. That is the whole reason Hamas exists. I see Israel as Russia in this case. I don't care who is more cruel. The dead are dead. I totally agree about Ukraine. As for Israel, my concern is that Israel is not merely fighting to eliminate Hamas, but to continue their persecution and oppression of Palestinians. Israel has been very purposefully creating the conditions that led to this attack, and more violence is not going to stop it. Israel wants this violence as a pretext for further land grabs. This isn't even a conspiracy theory. Their leaders have said this explicitly. I don't know what the solution is, but I know that Israel is not merely defending itself. It is 100% complicit in this situation. I'm not entering the conversation due to lack of time for a comment that would require me a long time to write it down. The thing that amazes me is how someone that declares itself leftist can take the Israeli side on the Israeli-Palestinian war. I guess being an American plays an important role on the matter. In Europe, no self-declaring leftist would have any doubt about taking the Palestinian side. I feel that it's because we don't see events like they happen in a vacuum, but instead we consider the context. With respect to item 1, I do not believe that Russia has or had any desire to conquer all of Ukraine. They seem fairly content with the territory that they already took, and a negotiated peace at this juncture would spare both sides from further deaths. The US should be encouraging a negotiated peace rather than delusional goals like recapturing lost territory. 1. How can Ukraine defend itself alone against nuclear power when Ukraine basically gave off its nuclear arsenal to US and Russia in 1994? To left Ukraine alone means to left Ukraine to die. This is morally wrong. As for pragmatics, US should be interested in weakening Russia, so providing more weapons to Ukraine is a good thing. Also, Russia would not collapse if Ukraine wins the war, so more and more weapons should be provided. US congressmen should just read General Zaluzhny's articles for The Economist and they will understand what has to be done. I'm glad you are Ukrainian. I see a lot of common sense in what you wrote.